indeed. Stand up for Jesus, the trumpet call obey. For to the mighty conflict in this his glorious day, ye that are men now serve him against unnumbered foes. Let courage rise with danger and strength to strength oppose. Stand up for Jesus, stand in his strength alone. The arm of flesh will fail you, ye dare not trust your own. Put on the gospel armor and watching unto prayer, where duty calls or danger, be never wanting there. All right. If y'all want to go ahead and mark in your songbooks 223, I'll be the invitation.
Well, how's everybody doing this evening? It's good to see all of y'all here. I was asked last night, I believe it was, to do a lesson here, and I'm honored to come and teach again. I've taught here before, and of course I always love coming out here, and it's really nice. So, today's Father's Day. Earlier somebody accidentally told me Happy Father's Day, and I'm like, it's kind of funny, all these people who think I'm married with children. I don't know where they get that idea that I'm not a father, but of course, anyone watching this who is a father, Happy Father's Day. And of course, just about any holiday you get, if it falls on a Sunday, you're going to have a preacher that's going to say something about that holiday, So this morning at Cloverdale, there was a lesson on Father's Day. So, it did kind of get me to thinking, which the bulk of this lesson isn't really about fathers per se, but, it makes a good lead into it. A good father, of course, is very important, especially for a child. And, whenever you have a child, very dependent on their parents, a lot of times they look to their father and it's just like, dad's invincible, dad can do anything. If dad's there, I don't have to worry about anything. Dad's here to protect me, And of course, throughout the Bible, God is oftentimes referred to as Father, and I don't think that's a coincidence at all. And I think that childlike faith that children often have in their fathers, we need to have that kind of faith in God, that kind of trust. If you're learning how to ride a bicycle, a lot of kids, as long as dad's standing right beside them, they feel like they can do this. They don't have to worry about falling, And that's how we need to be with God. We need to have that sort of faith in God. And, of course, we look in the Bible, we see how we're supposed to live, we see the type of ideals we need to live by. But unfortunately, we see that oftentimes in the Bible it doesn't really work out that way. In fact, very often we read in the Bible of the way you're not supposed to be. You look in Numbers chapter 13. We know that God promised Abraham that the land of Canaan will belong to his descendants one day. We know that the Israelites saw for themselves that they have God on their side. There's no reason to doubt. But we read in Numbers chapter 13, We'll look in verse 17. It says, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, Go up into Negeb and go into the hill country, and see what the land is, and whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities that they dwell in are camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. So they're, told to do all of this. And they go out and they spy out the land. And they come back. Skip down to verse 25. It says, At the end of 40 days they returned from spying out the land, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, We came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. All right, so they went out and spied it, and they saw how good it was. They said it was the land flowing with milk and honey. So, got that so far. But in verse 28 it says, However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of Negeb, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. So they're scared. They've seen how strong these people look. Now Caleb, he stands against this. He's like, don't you know we can overcome this? We have God on our side. But the people, the other spies, they bring back a bad report. There's giants over there. We can't do this, they say. And we read about Joshua and Caleb. They're really trying to motivate Israel to go ahead with God's plan. Let's do this. Let's go and take this land. And the people were so scared. In verse 10 of chapter 14 it says, Then all the congregation said to stone them with stones. These people are so scared to go in this promised land, they're about to kill the people who are trying to tell them that God's got this. And we see a pattern throughout here in this wilderness narrative. People of Israel rebel. Moses intercedes on their behalf. God decides to not destroy them. And oftentimes, they're rebelling against Moses, and Moses is the one who intercedes for them. Kind of tells you about how great of a guy Moses was, But you see, we know that for our faith to be evident, we got to do something. The Israelites here couldn't prove themselves by taking over empty land that had nothing on it. But there has to be something there that they can look at and say, we can overcome this. Like these giant people, these strong men. With those strong people there's something, I guess you could say, in the way. There's a trial. There's an obstacle. They need to be able to see past that. We look back at Abraham whenever he's told to sacrifice his only son Isaac. Abraham, he's in the Hall of Faith in the book of Hebrews. Well, Abraham had to do something to make his faith manifest, And so these people, they showed that they didn't really have faith, And throughout our lives, there's obstacles that are put in our ways, but we got to keep that trust in God. We can't let our faith in God wither away. Now, y'all know the story of Job. I was actually reading through Job a few weeks back, and it's a book I really like. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of back and forth stuff. And Job's a really interesting book. A question that comes up a lot even today is, how could, bad things happen to good How could a loving God allow this to happen? And this book here does address that issue, you know. But, you know, we all know the story. We know that Satan meets with God, and he tells God that, you know, people only worship you because you give them good stuff. And, you know, we end up with a challenge. You know, it's like, you know, you can take Job's family, you can, you know, inflict him with boils and all that. But I guarantee you that Job will not turn his back on me, you know. And, you know, we have all this back and forth between Job and his friends. You know, it's like, you know, Job's friends are just like, well, you must have done something wrong. Because, you know, commonly, you know, we tend to think, at least in this society here, there's a tendency to think things like, well, if something bad's happening to you, that means God's punishing you for it. I mean, you know, here in the beginning, in chapter 1, it talks about how wealthy Job is. It also talks about how faithful he is. You know, it's just kind of like faith means rich, you know, poverty means punishment for evil. Now, of course, you know, we know generally that's not really how things work. One thing that always gets on my nerves are watching the TV preachers giving the prosperity message, you know. But sometimes in the Old Testament, it does kind of look that way, you know. Got these men of faith, and God blesses them with stuff. But, you know, this book does address the issue of bad things happening to good people. And, you know, Job does complain a bit. He doesn't denounce God necessarily, but he does complain a lot, you know. So, in chapter 38, God talks back to Job. And this whole section, like chapters 38 and 39, 40 and 41, it's a really great section to read. I mean, this is God's answer to Job. But you know, whenever you have the time later, you know, you should read all of it. But we'll look at this little bit here for now in this lesson. In Job chapter 38, starting in verse 1, it says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man, I will question you, and you make it known to me." So God's going to pose Job a lot of questions. In verse 4 he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far you shall come and no further, and here shall your proud waves be stayed." You know, in other words, don't you know that I'm God? Don't you know all the stuff I've done? You know, I mean, he's kind of telling Job, you know, you don't know me better. You know, Job, you're a man. And he's an upright man, but you know, but even to Job, you know, God's mind is just unsearchable, really. And don't we read that in the Bible elsewhere, you know, just how infinite God's wisdom and knowledge is, far surpasses ours. And a lot of times we just don't really think about it. You know, we just I don't know, we take it for granted a lot of times, I think. But you see, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, you know, having that childlike faith in God. You know, we got to understand that God knows more than we do. You know, what we think, what we feel in the moment, that's not the final answer. You know, that's not all there is to know. God knows more than we do. Years ago, whenever I was a teenager in the youth group at Cloverdale, that was another kid there. He used to teach class a lot. And he did a lesson on trusting in the Lord. And he started off with this story. That there was a man, he was mountain climbing, and he kind of, fell, and, he's hanging by that bungee cord, and he calls on God for help, and God speaks back to him and tells him to cut the cord. And the guy basically tells God, "You're crazy." And a few days later, his dead body is frozen, is found 6 feet above the ground. That guy couldn't see that he was only 6 feet over the ground. All he had to do was just cut the cord and he'd be saved. But God knew. He ignored God at his peril. It's things like that. It's like God sees more than we see. We also have this with Jesus walking on the water. In Matthew chapter 14 and verse 22, it starts to say, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side where he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was long away from the land, beaten by the waves, and the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "Oh, you have little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." We like to kind of pick on Peter for his lack of faith. He took his eyes off Jesus, focused on the storm. He started to sink. And yes, he does deserve some criticism for that. But you realize that he was the only one who jumped off the boat and walked on water. Not a single other disciple had that kind of faith. You ever really thought about that? So this whole thing with Jesus walking on water and Peter walking on water too. Peter jumping off that boat and getting on the water was a huge act of faith. Do we have that kind of faith? If Jesus told us to walk on water, would we try it? But of course, he took his eyes off of Jesus. When he kept his eyes on Jesus, he did all right. That's what we got to do. We got to keep our eyes on God. We got to keep our faith in God. Don't worry about the storm going on around us. Like going back to Job. Job had a lot of bad things happening to him. But have faith that God's doing this for a reason. Or even with the Israelites. The Israelites go to this land. There's all these giant people there. And they keep their eyes on God. So whenever we lack trust in God, it does hurt our spiritual life. In more ways than one, of course. Jesus tells us to not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Jesus tells us about the birds and the flowers. And look how God takes care of them. Jesus says that Solomon in all his glory was, not arrayed as one of these. So, God takes care of the birds, he takes care of the flowers. But aren't these kind of insignificant compared to a human soul? God's going to take care of them, he'll take care of you. Whenever we worry about our material well-being, it does cut into our spiritual life. If you spend all your time, focusing on material gain, how much time are you going to have to worship God? How much time are you going to have to pray, read the Bible, sing praises to God? And it's kind of an easy trap to fall into because especially like you've got a family, you kind of think to yourself, well, I got to take care of my family, And you see how that can be kind of easy to kind of fall into the trap of just relying on your own works to take care of everything. Because I mean, we got to eat, we got to have shelter, you got to provide for your family. But we got to remember that God will help us. God will take care of us. Jesus tells a parable in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. It says, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.' But he said to him, 'Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?' And he said to him, 'Take care, be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions.' And he told them a parable, saying, 'The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' Wouldn't it be really nice to just have, in your fridge enough food to last you forever? You just never have to worry about buying food again. Wouldn't it be nice to have that house paid off? Wouldn't it just be nice to just never have to work another day in your life? You just got everything you need. So that's kind of how this rich guy is, I got plenty of food. I'll tear down my barn, build a bigger barn, put all of my food in it. And I can just relax. I don't have anything else to worry about. In verse 20 it says, But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now I think that there are a couple of things we can take away from this. For one, Jesus would always tell us, don't store our treasures on this earth. Put our treasures in heaven. But here's something else. This man harvested all this food for himself. And it's just like, well, God told him, your life is going to be required of you tonight. You did all this for nothing. Isn't that kind of sad to think about? It's like you do all this work and it ends up all being for nothing. You did all this for yourself and it's all for nothing. It's like, Jesus used to talk a lot about giving to the poor. It's like, oh, couldn't he have given this stuff, this grain to people who need it instead of just storing it for himself? But it's just the idea, he's just kind of relying on himself. It's just like, look what I did. And we kind of see something similar with like the Israelites when they were wandering in the wilderness and God would send them manna, and he always told them, just gather enough manna for today. Don't stock up for the next day, except of course the day before the Sabbath. But don't stock up for tomorrow. Just enough for today. And why do you think that was? Have faith that God's going to have more tomorrow. So, sometimes we just spend a lot of time chasing material goods, building up our wealth. And it's just taking us away from God. Because by spending all this time on these, it's like we're kind of saying we don't think God's going to take care of us. We got to rely on ourselves. That's a sad thing to think about. But Jesus tells us, to not worry about things. He tells us to be don't be afraid of what can destroy the flesh, but what destroys the soul. Those are the type of things we really need to be afraid of. But Paul the Apostle, he had things pretty comfortably whenever he was following the old law. You think of how much Paul lost whenever he turned his back on that, whenever he followed the new law, whenever he followed Christ. And not only he lost a lot, but he also had a lot of pain inflicted on him. I mean, Jesus did say that he'll suffer for my name's sake. Jesus did say that. But Paul the Apostle had a good attitude about it. That was a man who had faith. And he talks about God's provision in Philippians 4, starting in verse 10. He said, I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound, and in any and every circumstance I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance, and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So, the Philippians were concerned about Paul, and he's thanking them for their concern. But he can make it. He's learned how to be content. Because he can do all things through Christ who strengthens him. It's because he had that kind of faith in God. And we need to approach God with that sort of faith. Just kind of like the young child that feels safe as long as dad's around. That's how we need to be with God. We need to not depend on ourselves for our survival, but depend on him. We need to have faith that he'll provide. We'll have to have faith that he can help us overcome our obstacles. That's the kind of faith we need. And of course, it's never too late to start that. It's never too late to renew your faith and come to him. So if you need prayers, if you need your faith renewed and strengthened, will you please come forward as we have the invitation.
Let's sing the first, second, and fourth verses. 223. Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the